Hello, I'm David Rovix, and hopefully you can all hear me on the various platforms that we are live on. And I'm just going to check, and it appears that we should be broadcasting on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, VK, LinkedIn, and Twitch. And your comments and questions throughout are most welcome. I will be able to see them, and let's see. Yeah. And share anything relevant with my guest. And yeah, so to begin, I'm David Rovix, and you are tuned into my new live stream show, Discussions with David. At least as long as everything is shut down out there, I'll keep doing this show on a regular basis. I'm not committing to a strict timetable at this point, but generally I'll be broadcasting most days of the week, usually at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. Like everything else I do as a songwriter, especially in this era of declining income, free streaming, and ever-increasing costs of living, which was all the case before the viral crisis we're in now, my livelihood is entirely based on a combination of touring and the ongoing support of the hundreds of you who support me through the community-supported art program, which I began to set up in 2013 when the bottom fell out of merch sales. Now, in these times when we can't tour at all, my livelihood is derived even more from this kind of crowd-funded support. If you want to help me keep doing this sort of thing, as well as to get access to a bunch of stuff such as my audio memoir, which are exclusively available to my patrons, then please visit davidrovix.com/subscribe or patreon.com/davidrovix. Now, on to today's show. When I first met Guy Smallman at a gig I did at a squat in London, England, almost 20 years ago, he was in crutches with a very broken leg. His leg had been broken because Swiss police dropped him from a bridge onto the street below. The especially ironic part of this equation was that Guy had by then already spent much of his adult life traveling in and documenting in photographs and words a lot of places generally more dangerous than Switzerland, such as Afghanistan, where he has been many times. Before England shut down, along with much of the rest of the world, Guy started up an online publication, finalhours.org.uk, to cover the sorts of cultural activities that tend to get ignored by the mainstream media. In between making documentaries about refugees with real news, photographing protests on assignment for the Socialist Worker and other publications, and making frequent trips to interesting places around the world to do more of that sort of thing, Guy has also been a frequent organizer of benefit shows and other events in London, which have frequently featured me, along with many other folks. If the borders weren't closed down, I'd likely be having a conversation with Guy in a somewhat more private setting in a cafe in London right about now, instead of online in a public broadcast, but times have changed. Guy Smallman, welcome to Discussions with David. And we have a few comments already. Somebody says I sound sick, so that's not a... so two people think I sound sick. Do I sound that bad? I'm not sick. But no, okay. I think, and as long as I sound audible, and then it's okay. Guy, my first question I know is a very standard question, but in these times, it's actually of great interest, I think, to many people. How are you doing?
I'm fine, but I just need to start with a quick correction. It was someone else who was dropped off the bridge. I was the one that was shot with a stun grenade, but it was the same day. So it's an easy mistake to make. But
but wait a second, it was the same day. But you were not hanging on a rope, or somebody else was hanging on a rope from a bridge?
No, yeah, that was an activist who was blocking the bridge by hanging the rope.
And you were taking pictures.
Actually, I was in a different part of town, and I was just in a fairly peaceful demonstration, which the Swiss cops, who were quite bored, decided to attack. And they had lots of new toys, including these flashbang grenades, which they started chucking around the place. And one of them exploded on the back of my leg, and the result of which was about a month in hospital and an addiction to morphine. But I'm better now.
And it really took a chunk out of your leg as well. It's
Yeah, it made a dreadful mess. In fact, the skin graft is now at a stage where I can get Swiss made tattooed on it at some point if I so choose.
you could get a tattoo on the skin graft
Yeah.
made in Switzerland. That would be, yes, Swiss made. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, they do make good things in Switzerland, at least electronics and yeah,
Cheese.
cheese. Yeah. So yeah, so I want to talk about a lot of different things, but I want to also just sort of fast forward to the present moment. How long have you been? When was the last time you were able to leave England? I mean, you've been in your apartment most of the time now for several weeks. Are you in a quarantine situation yourself?
Well, it's kind of okay. So the first bit of your question, the last time I was actually out of the country was literally just before the lockdown started, and I was covering the situation on Lesvos because the Turkish President Erdogan had decided it was time to blackmail the European Union a bit more, so he sent of refugees, and so I went to cover the situation there. It has to be said, it's very different to the last time I went there. The last time was in 2015 during the big refugee crisis, and the big camp on Lesvos in a place called Moria. The conditions then were just as disgusting as they are now. Very little sanitation, no running water, and all that kind of thing. But at least then the people only had to be there for a week or two while they got their paperwork and then went to Athens. And then from Athens, they'd go to Hungary or to Sweden or wherever they were trying to get to. Whereas now they're just trapped there. So you've got a space that's designed for probably just under 3,000 refugees, and you've got literally 22,000 people living on top of each other. It is a horrendous situation. I'd say that probably about 85% of them are Afghans. And
wow.
Of those Afghans, 85% of them are from the Hazara minority, who have always traditionally been a persecuted minority in Afghanistan. They're the ones that have had their mosques blown up by the so-called Afghan branch of the Islamic State because they tend to be Shia Muslims rather than Sunni Muslims. They're also hated by the Taliban because they were seen as people that collaborated with the sort of pro-Soviet government back in the day. They look quite different to other Afghan people as well. They tend they look kind of like Chinese or Mongolian in appearance. They tend to be Shia Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
And the day we got there, I couldn't believe the size of the place. So I went with the journalist I was working with, the guy from Socialist Worker, and we went up to the top of the hill just so I could take some photos of like the camp from above. And then we kind of look behind us, and suddenly there's all these young kids with masks and baseball bats and kitchen knives, and we're thinking, shit, what's going on? And then we looked in the other direction, and there's many more kids with like masks and knives and baseball bats coming towards each other, and we found ourselves in the middle of them. So we got out of their way, and then there was this like horrendous like pitch battle.
Who were the different sides?
It was like Hazara youth versus like Pashtun and Tajik youth.
Oh, wow.
All those kind of ethnic divisions that you get in countries like Afghanistan, they get translated into those camps, and then they get magnified. And suddenly the Hazara people suddenly find themselves in the majority, so there's maybe a bit of payback going on there as well.
Right, interesting.
Obviously, my worry now, as you know, from other places where there's extreme poverty, is what the hell is the virus going to do in that camp?
Mm-hmm.
You've got people. I mean, it's just impossible for people to socially distance themselves in living in conditions like that.
No, and we know from the last big pandemic that it was largely people in overcrowded slums of the British Empire in India and places like that that suffered the worst. Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. On top of that, you've got people who have already got like a really poor diet. They've already got compromised immune systems. They're mostly, staying warm and cooking on campfires, so they're breathing in this like crap all day anyway. Often burning plastic, to stay warm.
Mm.
So, this is just so the conditions there are sort of like cold and damp at night and humid and damp during the day, which is, it's just imagine that the camp is just like a giant Petri dish for like growing coronavirus.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, and the last report I heard was that, the cops were stopping NGO volunteers from getting in there because they were worried that they're going to take it back into Mytilene, which is the main town on Lesvos. I've been trying to contact people I know there on WhatsApp and stuff. I've not heard anything for a few days, but I'm kind of fearing the worst, if I'm honest.
Yeah, because the idea is to quarantine the place and let them all die and let God sort it out, as they said in Vietnam, the American occupiers did, and then and then see what's left after it's all over.
Yeah, and obviously that is a situation. I mean, that's not unique to Lesvos. Lesvos, conveniently for the European Union, is an island that's conveniently close to the Turkish coast, where these people cross by boat. So, it's a place where they can use it as a stopgap. So,
and I mean, what's going on in there is sort of a concentrated sort of example, like a bit of an extreme example of the whole problem today, and with inequality in the world. If you want to boil it down into one island, I mean, Lesvos is one place that you could pick to illustrate the basic problem we have on this planet right now with this pandemic and with a lot more. But when you were you were also, I mean, I think it's worth mentioning too that before this refugee crisis, which by any definition is a refugee crisis, beginning in 2015, there were also, of course, lots of refugee crises that were not being called a refugee crisis in Europe yet, but certainly in Greece it was a crisis, and we were both in Athens around that time in 2012, and you were there on a number of occasions around that time. But it was already a place full of refugees that were often unhoused and living in the streets in terrible conditions, and a rising fascist movement growing in response to the many various things, including the existence of refugees in the country, in Greece, along with the lots of support for refugees among the Greek population. But this was all sort of a bit of a kind of it was already reaching a boiling point back in 2012, wasn't it, in a way?
Oh yeah, I mean, under international law, if somebody's life is in danger, they should be allowed to travel to a place of safety. I mean, that is written into international law. But the reality is with the Dublin II agreement all those years ago, the European Union said, okay, yeah, you can travel to a place of safety, but you have to stay in the first country you stay in, which is ridiculous for two reasons. Firstly, because a lot of those people are trying to reach their actual relatives, their actual family. And their family and relatives tend to be in some of the better off European countries that can actually afford to take care of them, like Sweden, like Germany, like Britain, places which have economies which could actually do with an influx of skilled workers.
Mm-hmm.
But geographically, all the countries where the refugees land first, have been Greece, Italy, and Spain, which are the countries that can least afford to look after them. It's the countries where the refugees landing there have no connection whatsoever, are very unlikely to have relatives. And it's also the countries that have been most affected, particularly Greece, have been most affected by the austerity package which the EU heaped on those countries.
Yeah, so anybody who has lived, if you've ever lived in England or Germany or spent time in any of those northern European countries, you have met lots and lots of people from Italy, Greece, and Spain who moved there for work, as anybody can tell you there. And so, this is where the refugees are ending up, in the places that are already countries of migration.
Yeah. Exactly. And during the refugee crisis in 2015, Angela Merkel took a big gamble, and she announced that she would allow 1 million refugees to come and settle in Germany. So a lot of those borders were opened and allowed to, for those people who at the time were the majority were Syrian, but the second biggest group by far were Afghans. To travel to Germany and settle. And everyone at the time was, talking about what a wonderful humanitarian Merkel was. The reality of the situation was that Germany had a massive skill shortage. It had a massive labor shortage. And Merkel is, before anything else, she is an economist. She's certainly not a humanitarian if you look at the way she treated countries like Spain, Italy, and Greece during the great financial crash of 2008. But she realized that she could actually fill that skills gap in Germany, and it's now paying dividends. If you look at the size of the German economy, I mean, everything she gambled on has come up trumps for the German economy. But she also realized another thing as well. The people that could actually afford to flee from Afghanistan and flee from Syria were people, who had the money to do it. It is not cheap to transport yourself and your children, across the world. Those smuggling gangs, they cost a fortune. Okay, which meant that they were people coming from like middle-class backgrounds. And when I was on Lesbos then in 2015, the first thing I noticed, when I was filming and photographing those people coming off the boats and trying to help them onto the shore and stuff, is that most of them spoke English. They already, that was a skilled workforce in waiting, a very skilled and grateful workforce. So don't ever think that Angela Merkel was thinking about anything other than German economy when she said that. And also at the same time, she's now put Germany in a position whereby when like far greater numbers of people start moving, probably due to climate change in the next like 10, 20 years, Germany can turn around and go, well, you know what, we've done our bit. We took 1 million people back in 2015. Now it's your turn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. And speaking of dealing with vulnerable populations who are about to be condemned to death in large numbers by this pandemic, what's going on? Any idea as far as in the prisons in England where you are?
Okay, there's very little information coming out. We actually, my flatmate the other day spoke to somebody who works in the prison service, and apparently they're not under lockdown. The association is still allowed. There has been cases inside prisons. We know that at least one prisoner have died. Family visits have been stopped, which is, a big issue for a lot of prisoners. But again, you're talking about people, who are already on a poor diet, who are already in a situation where they're sort of, it's the worst situation possible for anyone with a respiratory condition, with someone like asthma or something like that. So, we're kind of expecting it to get quite bad. But I mean, right now, we're not hearing much on the news. The big stories on the news is, yesterday, the official figures are all the people who've died of the virus each day who've tested positive. But the point that they're making is that, that's all the people who've died in hospital.
And they're not actually testing most of the people, and a lot of people are dying in their homes and they're not being tested. Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone who's dying in their homes, anyone who's dying in a care home, or any kind of retirement facility or retirement village or anything like that, there is absolutely no way they're going to be tested. Okay, so that will keep them out of statistics. And if they do eventually get sort of registered as a COVID death, then that will happen months down the line. So right now, I think we've got something like somewhere over 11,000 official deaths. But I mean, all the papers, even the right wing ones, even the ones that support the government, are saying it's possibly anything up to 50% more than that, and we're nowhere near peaking yet.
Yeah, and speaking of the right-wing ones, even the ones that support the government, isn't it strange how, there's just trying to even talk about these things in terms of what the media is saying, like the kinds of things that you hear on the media now is a lot, and the kinds of things that you hear from politicians these days is stuff that would have been really hard to imagine a month or two ago. Hearing the U.S. Surgeon General, who is like, I guess, basically the chief doctor, I believe a Trump appointee, talking about the how severe inequality is in the U.S. and how the vulnerable populations are being so adversely much more affected by this. And really, like the kind of stuff that you think, like, am I listening to Angela Davis here? Oh no, this is a Republican appointee of Trump. Like, and obviously this guy is a doctor who's well aware of what the term exponential means. And so, these people who look like they've just seen a ghost are people who understand what exponential means, I think, generally. And that's in terms of what might be coming. Not that I
absolutely know. And also one thing you've got to think of here is that, the other night I took a bike ride around central London, at 11, 12 at night, because I just wanted to see if, because the mayor had said, all the homeless people were going to be taken off the streets and put into hotels where they could isolate safely. And I cycled around the West End and Oxford Street and all those famous places. And, the numbers of homeless people there living in tents, living in shop doorways, sleeping in cardboard boxes was pretty much the same as you'd expect it to. I mean, obviously charities like St Mungo's and stuff are working, very hard, with the mayor's office and everything, to get everyone off the streets, but it's still, not happening. And will those people be counted? If they die of pneumonia on the streets? Possibly not. Will their families even be traced? So there's a lot happening there, and and certainly here, how can people self-isolate when they live in one of the unbelievably bad housing situations?
Yeah, specifically in certain neighborhoods in London that are especially overcrowded and really bad quality housing. Like, I don't want to give away what neighborhood you live in, but if you don't want to be public about that, but it's one of them.
I can, yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, one thing that they have been pointing out on the news services is that there's a disproportionately high number of people of Black, South Asian, Indian, Chinese origin who seem to be contracting the virus and dying from it.
That's what they're saying there too in England.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because these are people who, because of their ethnicity or because of their social status, are forced to live in conditions on top of each other. Now, as you know, because you stayed here, I live on one of the largest council estates in South London. And here, like everywhere else in the UK, we have set up a mutual aid group so that, we can, and as usual, it's the activists who have kind of taken the sort of initiative from the word go. And we're trying to do simple tasks for elderly and vulnerable people, because everyone in this country who's diabetic, everyone in this country who has had a transplant, everyone in this country who's over the age of 70 or has any underlying health condition, they got a letter off the government telling them not to go outside for 12 weeks. So,
and how is that going with the government aid in terms of like here in the US? I personally just got a direct deposit from the Internal Revenue Service, which I assume I'm one of many 100 million people or something that just got this direct deposit. I guess people who have not filed taxes and don't where the government doesn't have your bank account, they might not get their checks for months. But for most of us, we just got a bunch of money, which is also happening in Canada. Is that happening there too, where they're just distributing money?
Yes and no. Okay, so I'm self-employed. So
yeah, me too. But I got the money anyway. Everybody's getting it here, no matter what.
Okay, so we are getting that here, but not until July.
July. So from now until July, what are you supposed to do? I mean,
I'm just living off my savings and just trying to keep busy. And
then what about all the other people that have no friends who can loan them $100 or something? I mean, Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people are being furloughed, which means that they're keeping their jobs and they're still being paid. Mm-hmm. I will allegedly get 80% of my income, based on the past 3 years' tax returns, in sometime around July, which is great. So I can turn around to the council and say, look, I can't afford to give you any rent until then, but here's my self-employment number, so you will get it then. And the government have also said that they're not going to allow any evictions for 3 months, which is also quite a good thing. But a lot of people, when that 3 months comes up, I can't imagine a lot of private landlords in particular just turning around and saying, okay, where's my money, or you're out. And obviously illegal evictions of squatters and stuff will carry on anyway, and they are.
Yeah.
Also, think of a lot of those homeless people, as I said, that I saw on the streets the other night, and are now left begging outside the only supermarkets that are left open and the only shops that are left open. most people now, the advice is pay by everything with card. Let's stop cash flying around.
Yeah, right.
So these guys have now got no source of income at all. A lot of these people, particularly the ones with like alcohol and drug issues, they would have had they would have like been begging a certain amount of day to supply their habit and to try and eat. So, for the people at the bottom of the pile, this is an absolute disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also what we're seeing over here. There's Portland and all over the place. There's no people are homeless, and there's nobody around to give them any help. And there's the amount of really, really obvious, overwhelming distress that people are in is really like the mental illness that's being displayed on the streets is really like nothing I've ever seen. And we got somebody commenting on YouTube, Joni, saying in Florida that they are still taking the tents away from unhoused people living on the streets in Florida. And there's a homeless encampment in Miami with 300 people in it. And there are 2 porta potties and 2 hand washing stations, and the water smells like shit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, and also they're still taking down all those encampments in France. When they
in Calais.
Well, not just in Calais, because a lot of those people were then moved to Paris and were sleeping on bridges and stuff. And the French cops, with their usual restraint, come round at 3 a.m. with their tear gas and batons and just rip away everyone's possessions and take the tents away and load them all into like garbage trucks and take them away. And that's still going on as well. Still going on.
And are you hearing much talk or seeing much evidence of people organizing any kind of a rent strike action in around London? Is that a thing?
It's being talked about. We do have like a renters union here now who are getting more and more active and are trying to sort of help people out wherever they can, and doing a lot of very good actions. Well, they were until they all closed, but they were doing a lot of very good actions at estate agents and stuff, and occupying them and saying, this family want their deposit back and we're not going until they get it, and that sort of stuff. As I said, most activists are getting involved with like these different mutual aid groups, because with all these elderly and vulnerable people not able to go out, a lot of people need their shopping done for them. A lot of people need their prescriptions picking up from the drugstore and stuff like that. Really basic stuff that, and also people just need someone to talk to a lot of the time as well.
Yeah.
It's a really bad time for people with, issues around anxiety or, anything to do with mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I mean, just so many people in such isolation, not to mention the poverty and other logistical problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you been doing anything with Final Hours, the website that's covering cultural events around London and stuff, or that's kind of difficult?
It's kind of obviously difficult because our main thing is like live gigs, okay? Mm-hmm. And obviously all of those have stopped. So like the last gig review that I submitted was like a month ago. And it was actually a great band from your neck of the woods. I don't know if you've heard of them. There's like a feminist punk band from the States called Bad Cop, Bad Cop.
No.
They're absolutely fantastic. So we reviewed their gig and we've done an interview, which I'm going to be publishing in the next few days. But unfortunately, the gigs have stopped and it looks like there aren't going to be any again, like anytime soon. It's kind of weird to think that just a month ago, like we were at the New Cross Inn, the place was absolutely packed. It was a sold out gig and we were all talking about what festivals and stuff we were going to over the summer. And yet now we're all under house arrest. It's a weird situation.
Have you been tuning into many live streamed concerts and stuff like that? Or
this is what we're doing at the moment. We're trying to do sort of compilations. So there's a few things we're still doing. We're kind of doing these like compilation features of all these songs that are coming out. Like there's one of your songs actually on our Corona Tunes Volume 1, and I'm probably releasing Corona Tunes Volume 2 tomorrow, which is kind of a mishmash of like serious songs like by people like you and Rob Johnson about this like situation and the complete like shitness of governments and dealing with it and all that kind of stuff. So like it's kind of like comedy stuff like these sort of there's the Come On Eileen, which has been changed to COVID-19 by someone. And there's there's all these like parodies and pastiches and stuff that's coming out as well. So we're just kind of releasing those on the Newswire to try and keep people entertained. And there's also a lot of new music is still being released and was being scheduled to be released anyway, which obviously we can still put up album reviews, and we're doing that on a day-by-day basis, as stuff comes up that that we want to review. And once I've published the other 2 interviews that I've still got to write up from before the lockdown started, I'm going to start contacting people and just saying, look, this is really not ideal, but can we do like an interview by, Skype or by email? I mean, I'd much rather talk to people in person than get an idea of them. But so we're going to keep the interviews and certainly the album reviews and stuff going. And we're going to keep the Newswires like going as well with little features and stuff like that. But our live gigs, which is where we get most of our interviews from, have sadly ground to a halt for the foreseeable future. If anyone wants to go to the site, I'm just going to shamelessly plug it.
Yeah.
It's www.finalhours.org.uk, and we're always looking for new writers, new contributors, new photographers. We've got absolutely nothing else to do at the time, so just get in touch with us.
And what's happening these days with Real News? Are you doing anything with Real News? REEL?
I'm not involved in this one personally because our founder has actually taken this on. But they're running an extremely important campaign at the moment to try and close down all the building sites. Because although, allegedly everything non-essential has been closed down to stop the spread of the virus, to, protect the vulnerable people, to protect like national health staff and all this kind of thing, all the big building sites and big projects, are still going. And a lot of these places are not essential. A lot of them are luxury flats that are going to be, put up by oligarchs and just kept as an empty investment until they want to sell it and this kind of thing. So Real News are presently sort of like confidentially speaking to a lot of people on building sites, and they're getting really, really good information. They're getting good photos. Right. They're getting, video wherever possible to show how all these, the people who are running these sites are completely breaking the government's regulations when it comes, to dealing with this virus. I mean, it's impossible to socially isolate on a building site. Yeah. Now, if somebody's windows in their home are falling out and they've got 3 children, then obviously they need people around to fix it if they can't go out. But, when you're talking about building luxury flats, when you're talking about building like new department stores and stuff like this, and when you're talking about, the HS2 project, which is an abomination to begin with, okay, there is absolutely no excuse whatsoever for these places to stay open. And Real News have really taken that on. And I mean, obviously, I'm looking at all the incoming messages. I'm not answering them myself because someone else is doing that and coordinating it is, but they're leading a campaign at the moment to try and get something done about that. And again, go to like the Real News YouTube channel or go to realnews.co.uk. I'll just spell that for you. That's REEL news.co.uk. And there's a lot going on there. And also, by a staggering coincidence, it just so happens that the governing Conservative Party, a lot of their biggest donors and a lot of their biggest income just happens to come from people in the construction sector.
Coincidence. So many coincidences. Yeah.
Who'd have thought it?
Mm-hmm. And what about for the work, like taking photographs, doing the videos, interviewing the construction workers that are still out on the job as essential workers? Is that also considered essential work? Is it like journalism? Are you breaking curfew if you're going out to talk to people? Right.
So, okay. Obviously, most of the people that we're getting information from there is under strict condition of anonymity.
Yeah.
So, they're just sending us the material that they need electronically, and then we're dealing with it and making very, very clear. We're very, very, very sure that they can't be identified at all. But given a lot of these big sites have got, hundreds, if not thousands of people working on them, that's actually not a very difficult task.
Mm-hmm.
As far as journalists are concerned, we do have key worker status if we're covering the pandemic. So technically speaking, I could go out and flash my press card to a cop and say, I'm a key worker. Though, to be honest, unless I'm actually going out covering some aspect of the pandemic, I wouldn't do that because it's frankly irresponsible. Mm-hmm. And also, I'm kind of like busy doing all the stuff for the mutual aid group anyway. which I'm actually very glad about, because if I wasn't doing that, I'd probably just be sat here drinking and growing a beard or something. So that's kind of like, keeping me sane and keeping a lot of other people sane as well. And it has to be said that a lot of activist friends that I know are really using this as an opportunity to, make real connections in their communities and meet and, help out a lot of people they've never met before.
Absolutely.
So hopefully we'll come back stronger when all this is over.
Do you feel like that's a prevailing feeling, like everything has changed, things are going to be different now in a positive way, and we can't go back to the cutthroat capitalist status quo? Or is there a feeling of optimism?
I wish. I think it was kind of difficult. I mean, everyone's saying, all the real optimists amongst us you're talking about the Second World War and how everyone came back from the Second World War and said, okay, we're not going to go back and live in slums. We're not going to have this and we're not going to have that. And, it was the National Health Service was founded on the back of that, on a really strong Labour government that had an impetus of the people to do that. This is a slightly different situation. Half of the East End of London has not been flattened by the Luftwaffe. A lot of people, as soon as this lockdown ends, I think will probably just go straight back, and just want to live their lives again how they did before. But I think one thing that will change is that a lot of people have now realised quite how much money there is out there. Theresa May, the previous Conservative Prime Minister, who was actually almost as bad as this one, but not quite. She said her famous, phrase in the 2017 election was that there's no magic money tree. And yet, as soon as she basically lost that election to Jeremy Corbyn and ended up with a hung parliament, she then managed to magic out of thin air, £1 billion, followed by another £1 billion to bribe the DUP, who are the gangsters of British politics, into forming a government with her.
Yeah.
But, and that put them in a situation where they could, vote down pay increases for nurses and other public sector workers and stuff like that. Yet suddenly now, out of thin air, this government has come up with nearly 350 billion to keep business going, and that's just the next 3 months. So you actually, I think a lot of people will come out of this and think, well, hang on, where is all this money coming from that they said they didn't have before? So, a lot of their lies will be called out. People might have a better understanding of economics and how it works. But having said that, the government will also probably use this disaster as an excuse to inflict yet more austerity and more business and more misery on people, and say, oh, we can't afford this anymore, we can't afford that anymore. Look, we paid for your job to be furloughed. Look, we paid for your income, to be paid back to you, and all this kind of thing. So we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. I mean, right now, we have two really big problems, and that's firstly, the media are just not holding them to account. I mean, they never did. When we saw in the last general election quite how nasty our media are. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I now hate the liberal media even more than the right-wing media, because at least with the right-wing media, what you see is what you get. Whereas all these virtue signalling wankers from newspapers like The Guardian, who really, really showed their true colours when, Labour, elected, a leader who was actually a socialist.
They really did. I mean, when it comes to for anybody out there who is listening or watching this, if you're not from Britain and you are a regular consumer of BBC World Service, as I am, it's really as many pros and cons as a BBC World Service has. The domestic coverage of British politics is shockingly partisan. And they are not, and it's not just BBC, but actually supposedly progressive outlets like The Guardian, which does some fantastic reporting on domestic politics in the U.S. in terms of the class race divide and all kinds of other things. Really, really important journalism here. But their reporting in England, they were so consistently critical of Jeremy Corbyn, who was the most radical person to lead the Labour Party in the history of the country, and when it really matters, when things really mattered, then they did not come down in support of him.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, the reality is that these people don't shit where they eat, so they're quite happy to cause problems for Donald Trump, and and make fun of him on a daily basis. Although, to be honest, he does a better job himself of that than anyone else. But the likes of the Guardian, the Independent, I mean, also Channel 4 News as well. They would only ever give a platform to like really right-wing Blairite Labour MPs, and they would call that balance. And we've just had this scandal that's broken in the past couple of days, where this report's been leaked, which has actually showed how the right wing of the Labour Party undermined the Labour Party in 2017 to stop it from winning an election. I mean, that is how awful these people are. They would actually rather have Boris Johnson in number 10 than the leader of their own party. And when it comes to journalism, and even people who are supposedly on the left of journalism, like, as I said, like The Guardian, like Channel 4 and all the others, regardless of how right on they might try and look, regardless of how politically correct they might try and look over so many issues, their first loyalty will always be to the interests of their class and the contents of their pay packet. And I think the coverage in the last general election really, really exposed that more than anything else.
Yeah, it makes it very, very clear that, and also the as you say, the orientation of the leadership of the Labour Party, as well as the parallel with the United States, is also just really complete with the Democratic Party. That both of the leadership of these parties would actually rather have not only conservatives in power, but in the United States, they clearly would actually rather have fascism than actual, like, the possibility of somebody in office who believes in things like housing and healthcare and education are human rights, which of course is the case with both Corbyn and Sanders.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I would just actually like to briefly thank you all over there across the pond, though, for electing Donald Trump, because those of us who are like running out of things to watch on Netflix, in these difficult times, I mean, his daily press conferences are probably his meltdowns are probably the most entertaining thing, on the screen at the moment. And as his clear illness and instability gets worse, it is probably the best reality TV show that we have ever seen.
So, it really is. 40 minutes. It was a 40-minute long tantrum.
Yeah, I know. It is amazing. It is absolutely the most entertaining thing on TV at the moment. So
there's a pandemic happening. There are, tens of thousands of people dying on a weekly basis in this country, and he spends 40 minutes defending his leadership in this situation and taking no responsibility for anything that goes wrong before he then gives any information about how many people just died last night. It's really, it's very.
It's like the head of the free world has been replaced by Cartman from South Park, who's just having a perpetual tantrum. It is quite extraordinary to watch. I mean, I never thought I'd see anything like this. I mean, it's actually the dystopian comic books that I was reading in the 80s and 90s have not actually matched the reality of what is happening now.
Yeah. No, it's actually, we were just watching well, first of all, this movie Contagion, which is about a virus that sweeps the world, and governments are unable to deal with it, and because of all the kinds of reasons that are happening now. But the movie was so much more tame than the reality, which is way, way more exciting. But another thing that was an interesting thing that we just watched the other day, we've been watching movies because we stopped worrying about exposing the baby to movies after years of not watching any movies. Like, okay, screw it, we're just going to see what happens with the baby sees Godzilla. And the toddler has been having nightmares, so it's probably a bad idea. But we did watch Shin Godzilla, which is this 2016 remake. Well, not remake, but a new sort of version of Godzilla, basically. But it was actually brilliant political commentary, masqueraded as a monster movie. And it was basically all about Fukushima. Basically a fictionalized version of Fukushima, and instead of the nuclear meltdown, it's Godzilla, But in the movie, they are basically the political class in Tokyo is in Japan is basically prepared to sacrifice the capital city for the health of the Japanese economy. So that basically that's the sort of the long and short of it is what it comes down to, and the debate that goes on between them is just so wonderfully cynical. But as it turns out, it may be a little more cynical than the reality, because, like, to use the phrase that you just used, which I love, they don't shit in the same place that they eat. But as it turns out, when it comes to a pandemic that actually affects the rich, a bit more than it affects the middle class, actually, although not as much as it affects the poor. But this is a funny little. Funny is the wrong word, but it's like, there is this sort of inverted bell curve to this thing. It seems like the more people you know, the more likely you are to get this illness. And so that means if you're rich or poor, you're actually very vulnerable to this illness, along with all the other factors. I mean, you can see.
I mean, all these people like flying around the world in their like jets and stuff, they're all going through airports. And the one thing about this virus is that, unlike starvation, rich people can catch it. And it's, and certain people, regardless of how healthy they are, regardless of what medical equipment they've got at their disposal, some people are going to, it's going to kill them. They still know very little about it. I wouldn't describe it as any kind of leveler, because obviously, as we discussed earlier, people living on top of each other are going to catch it more easily than someone who's got like a house with a massive garden in Beverly Hills or something like that. But when you see all these like high profile people catching it and dying from it, we've had a member of the royal family here, the one from Longleat, I can't remember what he's called.
Yep. A member of the Spanish royal family, several senators in the U.S. Senate, many members of parliament from all over the world.
The head of the Vox Party in Spain got it. So, every cloud has a silver lining. I just wish Trump would get it. I mean, he's still insisting on shaking everyone's hand, and I just wish this virus would just be a little bit more, proactive in that department.
Yeah, I don't know how that's going to work with. I mean, they've been, the Secret Service has been trained at biosecurity for a long time, like keeping the president in a biosecure environment. I'm not sure how they do that if he's shaking hands with people or what that exactly means, but it's apparently a thing. I
mean, one thing that they were talking about here before they officially announced the lockdown, which they had no choice to do when they saw what was happening in Spain and Italy and places that were a month ahead of us, is they were talking about this idea of herd immunity. And the idea behind herd immunity is that, the virus will naturally progress its way through the population, and then everyone, who survives it will develop an antibody, and that will kill the virus.
It's basically Logan's Run.
Yeah.
Kill off the elders. Yeah.
Exactly. Which is
kill off the.
We have 66 million people in this country, and if the virus is guaranteed to kill 1% of the population, okay, which it pretty much is. I think in other countries it's gone up to 2% in poorer areas, but it's about 1% of the population. That is nearly 1 million people, and it's not just elderly people. We've had some people are just really, really unlucky when they get it. We've had babies, we've had children, we've had people in their 20s. We've had people who you'd never think would be vulnerable to this. A lot of people, health workers who tend to lead quite healthy lifestyles, have succumbed to it. And of course, that's another big scandal that we're dealing with here at the moment, is that this government just didn't take any time. At the same time that they were talking about herd immunity, which is kind of like, there's a kind of creepy sort of eugenics kind of feel to that anyway. But at the same time they were talking about that was the time that they should have been making massive preparations for like protective equipment for people on the front line of this virus. So is everyone who works for the NHS for a start, people who drive buses, people who work on the subway, the underground, and all that kind of thing. All of that, they should have been thinking about all of that then. We've now got a massive shortage of that equipment, with like people people making it themselves out of like refuse sacks and all that kind of thing. It's not being supplied to care homes. The government was saying that care homes had to take people recovering from the virus, but people working in those care homes were not getting that protective equipment. If you're caring for someone that's got Alzheimer's or something like that, you can't stand 2 meters away from them and expect them to understand every instruction that you've got. So you need the equipment to be able to deal with that. So that's like a very big scandal that we've got at the moment here is how this government, and I think, when the real figures come out about the death count, and when, and as this progresses, and and if our death count gets higher than Spain and Italy, which I think it will, I think this government are going to be in real trouble, and they're going to have a lot of questions to answer. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, the media are not asking those questions at the moment, and the new leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, who does not exactly come from a radical background,
no,
keeps saying that now is not the time we've got to be working with the government. No, he's got to be holding them to account. He's been in the job for, about a week, and he's already useless. But this is the person who used to be the director of public prosecutions and always sided with the cops in contentious cases. So it's not exactly like he's breaking the mold that he's been in for the past God knows how many years.
No, but if we do end up seeing, it seems like if some of the predictions, if the level of incompetence continues in terms of how they're dealing with this pandemic in places like Britain and the United States, especially the United States, but many other countries, then it may not be a great leveler, but with that many people dying and with governments exposed as being so incompetent, something's there's going to be changes. I don't know what they're going to be, but one of the things I find so fascinating, and it's horrifying, but it's fascinating, is that like all these countries, they're all members of NATO. They're all countries that supposedly are ready for World War III, for Pete's sake. I mean, they're supposed to be ready to defend their shores from Russian attack or whatever. And the idea. So then so then a bad virus comes and they're completely incapacitated. You can see now. It seems so evident that countries like the UK and the United States have really been run on behalf of real estate speculators and bankers and keeping the economy going. Well, yeah, you need to have running water and housing for most people to do that, but that's kind of an afterthought. Whereas now suddenly it's like we see, okay, who was really prepared for, who had an actually functioning government? I mean, of course, lots of criticism, legitimate criticism to be said about somebody like Merkel, but she is a scientist, and they seem to have mounted a science-based and competent response to the pandemic, at least within the borders of Germany. Not at least so far, it appears that places like South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Germany have governments that actually were competently able to deal with a situation like this. But those who are not able to, and who are now risking becoming completely overwhelmed by exponential growth, as is the case here in the United States, I think, well, who knows what's going to happen, but it's that's going to be
I think it's been a disaster waiting to happen for years.
Yeah.
And you've had a lot of people who've been warning about this for years. And a lot of people on the left have probably taken their eye off the ball to think about climate change, as they rightly should, because however bad this virus gets, it doesn't compare to what's coming in the next couple of decades from climate change, unless humanity gets its shit together. But
the rich might survive. They can move to Norway or live in a bubble somewhere, right? Climate change.
Yeah.
They're not as concerned about that, because it may kill off much more than 1 or 2% of the population, but it's not going to be their 1 or 2%, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it has it's and also I think their main concern, obviously, a lot of these people, if they think they're vulnerable to it, I'm sure a lot of billionaires who suffer from diabetes or whatever have the resources to go to their private island and isolate there. But the effect that this is having on their finances, the effect that this is having on their personal wealth, is absolutely catastrophic. I think I'm with most of Great Britain when I cannot stop laughing at the sight of like a scumbag like Richard Branson going cap in hand to the government. This is the person who sued our National Health Service when he didn't get a contract, but he's going cap in hand to the government to beg for his airline, where he's just sent everyone home without pay, and he's going cap in hand to saying, "Oh, please, can I have $7 billion to bail out my airline?" I'd certainly bail him out with a knuckle sandwich if I ever met him. Fortunately, I never will.
Yeah.
I'd definitely do the jail time for him.
Oh, yeah. That's, me too. I was finally feeling emotionally stable enough to find out who my landlord was, because I was afraid I would do exactly the same thing to him if I ever discovered who he was. But turns out it's a corporation called the Randall Group. So
Okay.
can't strangle a corporation, but we're on rent strike, so it's the closest we could get to strangling.
Excellent.
90-day suspension of evictions. If you live anywhere, any of you watching, if you live anywhere where they have suspended evictions, there's no reason you should be paying rent. You may have to pay it all back at the end of the crisis, so try to save it if you can. But if you don't pay, then there may be a settlement at the end. That's how it works. That's why all these corporations are not paying the rent, as I imagine that's happening in England as well, where here we have Cheesecake Factory, Subway sandwiches, and Macy's are three that I know of who have all stopped paying their commercial real estate rent to the real estate companies that they rent their franchises from. They're all not paying the rent as of the beginning of this month.
Well, our biggest pub chain are called Wetherspoons, who are run by this right-wing and utterly clueless lunatic. I have absolutely no idea how he ever became so rich. He's like very much on the sort of right wing of the sort of Brexit movement and all this kind of thing. And he sent all his staff home and said, "I'm sorry, you're not getting any pay," even though this corporation or company, whatever it is worth a fortune. It's small potatoes to pay them all for a few months while there's no income. Didn't pay his suppliers either. And then people started chucking bricks through their windows and spraying "pay your staff" on the front of their pubs. And immediately that decision was reversed.
Interesting.
I think there's a lesson there for people.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it is, but, use your imagination, folks, and see how that goes.
Yeah. It just might be the case that collective action can be effective, even if it involves bricks.
About mass civil unrest in France when lockdown ends. And if I'm going to take one trip abroad when lockdown ends, I'm going to be in Paris to see what goes on there, because that's going to be
yes.
And also, at the end of the day, I mean, I'll be honest with you. Right now, the cops are just, they're relying here on everyone's cooperation.
Yeah.
Because everyone has a relative that's died or has a relative that's sick and everything. People understand that. But, sooner or later, it'll get to the stage where the cops start abusing their newfound powers. And on their usual victims, like, young black kids and young Muslim kids and stuff like that. And there's going to be an awful lot of energy to explode when this situation ends. So, I mean, we're totally in uncharted territory here. So who knows what's going to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. That is for damn sure. And I suppose it's coming to the end of the hour, and it's a good place to end with, although I still have a whole bunch of questions, but we can do this again sometime soon. My plan is probably to have regular guests, since there's always regular development. So it's always good to talk to the same people over and over again, if they're, certain folks. That was not well phrased, but Guy Smallman, thank you so much for joining me on my little Discussions with David live stream broadcast. This will be archived on various platforms, and look for Guy on Twitter and Facebook and Real News and finalhours.org.uk. And we'll see you again soon.
Dave, great to see you as always. Take care.
You too. Thank you. And this has been a discussion with photojournalist Guy Smallman. You can find him, as I said, on Facebook, Twitter, and at finalhours.org.uk, among other places. Tomorrow, I'll be talking with one of my favorite songwriters on the planet, who we also mentioned briefly, another Englishman named Rob Johnson. That's with 2 B's, in case you want to check out his music before the show starts tomorrow. And on Saturday, I'll be talking with Margot Black, a leader of Portland Tenants United here in Oregon, who is currently running for Portland City Council. And I'll probably also do a show on Friday. I'm not sure. I'm just waiting to hear from somebody. You'll find all these discussions archived on a Discussions with David playlist on my YouTube channel, and I'm also putting each one out in audio-only podcast form. If you don't want to miss an episode, subscribe to my podcast, This Week with David Rovics, wherever you get your podcasts. Hope to see you again soon here in The Matrix. Don't pay the rent, and thanks for listening.